At dawn in the years after independence, the air over central Uganda often carried the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, a residue of rural life that lingered even in the capital. Roads built for colonial administration cut through neighborhoods that were still learning how to imagine themselves as parts of a single nation. The quiet suggested promise, but it was an uneasy quiet, shaped by memories of authority imposed from outside and by the sudden absence of that authority. Independence had arrived with ceremonies and speeches, yet beneath them lay questions that had not been answered about power, loyalty, and the meaning of unity in a land stitched together by imperial convenience rather than shared political experience. The colonial state had ruled by managing difference. Ethnic communities were cataloged, ranked, and assigned roles that served administrative efficiency more than social coherence. Some regions were favored for education and clerical work, others for labor or military recruitment. These patterns did not dissolve with the lowering of the British flag. They hardened into expectations and resentments, shaping how communities understood their place in the new order. Political competition after independence, therefore, did not begin on neutral ground. It emerged from a landscape already scored by inequality, where cooperation required trust that history had made difficult. At the center of this tension stood the unresolved relationship between the modern state and older forms of authority. The Uganda kingdom, with its deep-rooted institutions and sense of historical sovereignty, occupied a particularly fraught position. For many Baganda, independence did not mean absorption into a centralized republic so much as renegotiation of autonomy within it. For leaders committed to national integration, Uganda represented both a cultural pillar and a political obstacle. The question was not merely constitutional, but emotional, touching pride, memory, and fear of erasure. Civilian politics unfolded under these pressures, often more brittle than they appeared. Parliamentary debates and cabinet negotiations masked anxieties about legitimacy and control. Leaders such as Milton Obote spoke the language of national unity, but they governed amid suspicion that alliances were temporary and that loyalty could fracture along regional lines. Policies were judged not only on their merits, but on who benefited and who did not. Each decision carried the weight of precedent, setting patterns that others would later exploit. Into this uncertain space stepped the military, an institution shaped decisively by colonial priorities. Recruitment during the imperial period had favored certain northern communities, not out of trust, but because they were seen as physically resilient and politically peripheral. Training emphasized obedience and force rather than civic responsibility. At independence, the army inherited this structure with little transformation. It was suddenly tasked with defending a sovereign nation without having been socialized into the idea of civilian supremacy. Its officers understood power in practical terms: who commanded, who obeyed, and what happened when orders were ignored. As political disputes intensified, civilian leaders increasingly leaned on the army as a guarantor of stability. This reliance was incremental and often framed as temporary. Soldiers were deployed to maintain order, to signal resolve, to reassure allies. Each deployment normalized the presence of armed men in political crises. Over time, the distinction between protector and arbiter blurred. Officers observed the fragility of civilian institutions and drew conclusions about their own importance. Authority, once tasted, rarely remained abstract. Ordinary Ugandans felt these shifts in subtle ways. Checkpoints appeared on roads where none had existed before. Rumors traveled faster than official statements, carried by traders and bus drivers who measured the mood of each town they passed through. Silence became a form of caution. People learned to read uniforms, to note insignia and accents, to assess whether a soldier represented the state, a faction, or himself. Daily life continued. Markets opened, fields were tended, but with an undercurrent of watchfulness that marked a society unsure of its direction. Economic pressures compounded political unease. The promise that independence would swiftly translate into material improvement proved elusive. Infrastructure required investment, education systems needed expansion, and the global market offered limited generosity to new states. When resources were scarce, competition sharpened. Patronage networks filled gaps left by weak institutions, rewarding loyalty over competence. These networks, in turn, deepened divisions, making politics feel personal and precarious. By the mid-1960s, Uganda was not collapsing, but it was straining. Its constitution existed, its leaders governed, and its citizens hoped, yet the balance holding these elements together depended on restraint that could not be guaranteed. The military's growing visibility was both symptom and cause of this strain. It reflected civilian uncertainty and amplified it, creating a feedback loop in which each crisis justified greater force. The conditions for the rise of strongmen were taking shape not through destiny, but through accumulation, of mistrust, of expedient decisions, and of institutions asked to bear more than they were designed to hold. Idi Amin entered the world far from the chambers where Uganda's future would later be contested, born into a peripheral society that colonial administration understood primarily through utility rather than citizenship. In northwestern Uganda, where imperial presence was light and opportunity narrower, authority was experienced less as abstract governance than as physical enforcement. The rhythms of life were shaped by labor, migration, and the demands of a state that recruited bodies before it cultivated minds. For young men in such regions, the military represented not ideology but access to food, clothing, status, and a form of belonging otherwise unavailable. Amin's early years unfolded within this logic, where survival and advancement were inseparable from physical capacity and obedience. Colonial military recruitment was neither accidental nor egalitarian. British officers sought soldiers who could be molded quickly and commanded without complication. Education was secondary. Endurance and compliance were prized. Amin's entry into the King's African Rifles placed him inside an institution that rewarded presence and performance rather than reflection. Drill grounds replaced classrooms, and authority was demonstrated through immediate consequence. Advancement came not through debate or policy, but through loyalty, aggression, and a willingness to carry out orders without hesitation. In this environment, Amin learned to read power not as legitimacy, but as proximity to command. His rise through the ranks during the late colonial period coincided with a moment of transition that unsettled old hierarchies. As the British prepared to leave, they accelerated promotions to local officers, often without the institutional safeguards that might have accompanied such changes in a more stable system. Amin benefited from this urgency. He was visible, physically imposing, and unencumbered by competing professional identities. Where others hesitated, he complied. Where others questioned, he acted. These traits did not mark him as exceptional in moral terms, but they made him useful within a structure increasingly defined by uncertainty. Independence altered the army's context without fundamentally reshaping its character. The uniforms changed insignia, but the internal culture remained anchored in colonial precedent. Civilian leaders, including Milton Obote, inherited a force that had not been trained to see itself as subordinate to elected authority. They faced the immediate challenge of consolidating power in a fragmented nation while lacking fully developed civilian institutions capable of enforcing cohesion. The army, already organized and armed, became an expedient solution. Promotions and favors were distributed to secure loyalty, embedding patronage into military command structures. Amin's ascent accelerated in this environment. He aligned himself closely with Obote, not through shared ideology, but through mutual necessity. Obote required officers who could counterbalance rivals and project strength. Amin required protection and advancement. Their relationship was transactional, grounded in the logic of short-term stability rather than long-term governance. As Amin rose to senior positions, his authority expanded beyond formal rank. He controlled access to resources, dispensed rewards, and cultivated loyalty among troops who saw in him a conduit to privilege and security. The army itself was changing. Once a tool of colonial enforcement, it was becoming an arbiter of domestic politics. Its deployments increasingly addressed internal disputes rather than external threats. Soldiers were sent to manage protests, secure political outcomes, and intimidate opposition. Each such action reinforced the perception that political questions could be settled through force. Officers observed civilian leaders negotiating from positions of weakness, their authority contingent on military backing. This observation shaped ambition. Power, Amin learned, was less about constitutional order than about who commanded men with guns. Amin's personal conduct reflected this lesson. Reports from the period describe a man who embraced the symbols of authority with theatrical enthusiasm. Uniforms worn with embellishment, public appearances that emphasized dominance and confidence. These displays were not mere vanity. In a system where legitimacy was fragile, performance mattered. To appear strong was to deter challenge. Amin's lack of formal education, often cited by later observers, was less a hindrance than a non-issue within a military culture that privileged decisiveness over deliberation. Yet his rise was neither inevitable nor singular. Many officers navigated the same structures without pursuing unchecked power. What distinguished Amin was his readiness to exploit institutional gaps without concern for their long-term consequences. Weak oversight allowed personal networks to flourish. Ethnic favoritism deepened divisions within the ranks. Discipline became uneven, loyalty personalized. The army's transformation into a political instrument was not driven by one man alone, but Amin thrived within it, recognizing opportunities others feared. By the end of the 1960s, Amin stood as a product of Uganda's unresolved transition. His authority rested not on vision, but on accumulation, of rank, of loyalty, of proximity to power. The soldier of the new state embodied its contradictions, carrying forward colonial habits into a post-colonial arena unprepared to restrain them. His presence signaled how far the army had moved from the barracks into the center of national life, and how easily opportunity could harden into dominance when institutions faltered. As authority narrowed around the office of Milton Obote, governance in Uganda grew more centralized but not more secure. Decisions were increasingly shaped by the need to outmaneuver rivals rather than to build durable institutions. Parliamentary mechanisms remained in place, yet their influence diminished as executive power expanded. The logic was defensive. Obote faced opposition from regional leaders, traditional authorities, and political factions that questioned both his legitimacy and his vision of a unified state. Each challenge reinforced his conviction that survival depended on control, and control, in turn, depended on force. The military became the instrument through which this control was exercised. Its senior officers were drawn closer to the center of power, consulted on matters that extended beyond defense into political calculation. Among them, Idi Amin occupied a position of particular sensitivity. His command of troops loyal to him personally made him indispensable in moments of crisis. When civilian authority wavered, Amin's presence offered reassurance, a tangible guarantee that orders would be enforced. Yet this same quality rendered him dangerous. Dependence bred vulnerability. The more Obote relied on Amin, the more he acknowledged, implicitly, the limits of his own authority. Their alliance was sustained by mutual suspicion. Obote understood that Amin's loyalty was not ideological but conditional, tied to status and protection. Amin, for his part, recognized that his power derived from proximity to the civilian leadership, and that this proximity could be withdrawn. Each move was therefore calculated to maintain advantage without provoking confrontation. Promotions were granted and commands expanded, but rarely accompanied by trust. Surveillance and counter-surveillance became features of governance, conducted quietly and without formal acknowledgement. The consequences of this arrangement were felt throughout the state. Ministries hesitated to act decisively without assurance of military backing. Civil servants learned to anticipate shifts in favor, adjusting their allegiances accordingly. Policy coherence suffered as initiatives were judged not on effectiveness, but on political risk. Fear became an organizing principle. To move too boldly was to invite retaliation. To move too slowly was to appear weak. In this atmosphere, restraint was often mistaken for prudence, and delay became a substitute for strategy. Within the army, the effects were corrosive. Officers observed the transactional nature of power and adapted their behavior to it. Loyalty was demonstrated through alignment with individuals rather than institutions. Discipline varied depending on rank and connection. Amin's influence grew as he positioned himself as both enforcer and intermediary, capable of delivering obedience upward and rewards downward. His authority was reinforced by visibility. Inspections conducted with deliberate display, public ceremonies that emphasized hierarchy and command. These were not excesses but signals understood by those who watched closely. Obote attempted to counterbalance this influence through selective reshuffling and by cultivating alternative centers of loyalty. Units were redeployed, commanders reassigned. Such measures were intended to prevent any single figure from consolidating unchecked power. Yet they also deepened uncertainty. Officers read reassignment not as routine administration, but as warning. Each change suggested distrust, and distrust, once perceived, altered behavior. The army's cohesion weakened even as its political role expanded. Outside the corridors of power, the population sensed the tension without fully grasping its source. Public life continued, but with an undercurrent of apprehension. Rumors circulated of plots and counterplots, of arrests narrowly avoided, of meetings held behind closed doors. Silence acquired meaning. What was not said often mattered more than what was declared. The state projected authority, yet it was an authority strained by the knowledge that force, once invited into politics, rarely remained neutral. Key moments exposed the fragility of this balance. Constitutional disputes and security crises were resolved not through consensus, but through displays of strength. Each resolution set a precedent, narrowing the range of acceptable political action. Obote's consolidation of power, while successful in the short term, further entangled civilian leadership with military muscle. Amin's role in these episodes reinforced his indispensability while sharpening fears about his ambition. The alliance endured because neither man could afford its collapse, yet each understood that its continuation carried risk. By the late 1960s, governance had become reactive. Decisions were made to avert immediate threats rather than to address structural weakness. This short-termism compounded instability. Institutions designed to mediate conflict were bypassed, eroding their credibility. The Army's presence in political life became normalized, its intervention anticipated rather than resisted. In such conditions, the line between protector and ruler blurred beyond easy repair. The power behind the throne was not exercised openly, nor was it uncontested. It operated through implication and restraint, through the careful management of fear. Obote remained the head of government, Amin his most visible instrument. Yet the equilibrium between them was fragile, sustained by calculation rather than confidence. Each decision taken out of apprehension added weight to a system already under strain, setting in motion consequences that would unfold not through sudden rupture, but through the steady accumulation of mistrust. In January 1971, the transfer of power in Uganda occurred with little spectacle. There were no mass rallies filling the streets, no triumphant declarations broadcast with certainty. Instead, the change announced itself through absence. Milton Obote was not in Kampala when the army moved. He was abroad, attending a Commonwealth meeting, removed from the immediate mechanisms of command that had sustained his authority. In his absence, the state revealed how much of its stability rested not on institutions, but on proximity, on the physical presence of those who issued orders and those prepared to enforce them. The coup unfolded through familiar routines. Soldiers secured key installations, road junctions, and communication centers with practiced efficiency. There was no widespread resistance, not because the seizure was welcomed, but because resistance had been hollowed out by years of fatigue and caution. Civil servants remained at their posts, waiting for clarity that did not arrive. Ministers assessed their safety rather than their mandates. The machinery of government continued to function, but without direction, its momentum carried forward by habit rather than conviction. For the soldiers involved, the action was framed less as rebellion than as correction. Loyalty had been cultivated carefully in advance, reinforced by shared grievances and personal obligation. Units moved according to expectations established over months, even years, in which authority had increasingly flowed through informal channels. The absence of Obote removed the final obstacle. Orders were issued, followed, and normalized with striking speed. By the time announcements were made, the outcome was already decided. At the center of this operation stood Idi Amin, whose public role was initially restrained. His statements emphasized continuity and reassurance. He spoke of restoring order, of protecting the nation from internal decay. The language avoided triumph. It was calibrated to calm rather than inflame, to suggest necessity rather than ambition. This tone reflected an acute awareness of the fragility of legitimacy. Power had been taken, but it had not yet been secured. The public response was muted. In Kampala, people gathered in small groups, listening to radios, watching soldiers pass with measured expressions. There was curiosity, but also wariness. Years of political maneuvering had taught caution. Celebrations were conspicuously absent, not because the change was unwelcome, but because its meaning was unclear. For many, the coup represented neither liberation nor catastrophe, but another turn in a political landscape already marked by uncertainty. The smoothness of the transition owed much to exhaustion. Political life under Obote had been characterized by tension and consolidation, by disputes that drained confidence without resolving underlying problems. By 1971, the appetite for confrontation had waned. Opposition figures were dispersed or silenced. Institutions designed to contest power had been weakened. When the army moved, it encountered not resistance, but inertia, a society conditioned to adapt rather than oppose. Within the military, the coup clarified hierarchies that had long been implicit. Amin's authority, once exercised through influence and patronage, was now formalized. Promotions followed swiftly, rewarding loyalty and signaling the new order. These actions were administrative in appearance, but they reshaped the balance of power within the ranks. Officers understood the message. The chain of command was being redefined around personal allegiance, and deviation carried risk. International reactions were cautious. Diplomatic missions sought assurance of stability and continuity. Statements emphasized recognition and the hope for orderly governance. Few openly challenged the legitimacy of the takeover. This external restraint reinforced the internal sense that the transition, while irregular, would be tolerated. Amin's early posture capitalized on this ambiguity, projecting reasonableness while consolidating control. The absence of applause did not mean the absence of consequence. Quietly, the norms governing political life shifted further. The precedent that military force could resolve civilian disputes was no longer theoretical. It had been enacted with efficiency and minimal disruption. This efficiency carried its own warning. A power seized without resistance could be exercised without accountability. The mechanisms that might have moderated authority had already been eroded. The coup merely confirmed their weakness. In the days that followed, normalcy returned in appearance. Markets reopened, offices resumed work, and the rhythms of daily life reasserted themselves. Yet beneath this surface lay a recalibrated sense of vulnerability. People listened more closely, spoke more carefully. Soldiers were more visible, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. The state had changed hands without drama, but the conditions that allowed such a change lingered. The coup of 1971 was not a dramatic rupture, but a culmination. It drew strength from absence, loyalty and exhaustion rather than popular fervor. By the time its significance became apparent, the opportunity to contest it had passed. The tone of the new regime was set not through proclamation, but through method, quiet, decisive, and opaque. Power had moved smoothly, yet the ease of its transfer hinted at forces that would soon make themselves felt, not through celebration, but through consequence. The consolidation of authority under Idi Amin did not announce itself through sweeping decrees or ideological manifestos. It advanced through accumulation, through the quiet erosion of limits that had already been weakened by years of improvisation. Early assurances of restraint faded, not because they were explicitly revoked, but because they were rendered irrelevant. Decisions increasingly bypassed formal channels, moving instead through personal command. What had begun as temporary reliance on the military hardened into a governing principle, and the distinction between security and rule dissolved almost without notice. The army's presence in civilian life expanded steadily. Soldiers appeared not only at borders and barracks, but in ministries, factories, and local councils. Their authority was rarely questioned, in part because it was rarely defined. Orders were issued verbally, often without documentation. Their legitimacy derived from proximity to the center rather than from law. This ambiguity served power well. It allowed responsibility to diffuse downward, while control remained concentrated above. For those subject to it, uncertainty became a condition of daily life. Formal institutions persisted in appearance. Courts convened, officials held titles, and procedures were referenced. Yet their function was increasingly ceremonial. Outcomes were determined elsewhere, shaped by considerations of loyalty and suspicion rather than evidence or statute. Judges learned restraint, avoiding rulings that might provoke attention. Civil servants limited initiative, understanding that visibility carried risk. Governance narrowed to the management of compliance, not through consistent policy, but through selective intervention. Personal loyalty emerged as the primary currency of survival and advancement. Amin rewarded those who demonstrated devotion to him as an individual, not to the state. Promotions within the military were rapid and conspicuous, often bypassing established hierarchies. This reshuffling served multiple purposes. It bound beneficiaries directly to the president while keeping rivals off balance. Rank became less a measure of competence than of favor, and favor, once granted, demanded continual reaffirmation. Fear entered public life gradually, acquiring familiarity before it acquired clarity. Early acts of violence were targeted, framed as necessary responses to specific threats. They were explained, sometimes publicly, as measures to preserve order. Each incident carried an implicit lesson. Boundaries existed, but they were invisible and mutable. Safety depended not on rights, but on remaining unnoticed or well-connected. People adjusted accordingly, lowering their voices, narrowing their circles, and calibrating their expressions. As this pattern repeated, violence shifted in character. What had been selective became systemic, not through mass spectacle, but through routine. Arrests occurred without explanation. Detentions extended without record. Disappearances were spoken of obliquely, acknowledged through absence rather than confirmation. The lack of formal acknowledgement intensified anxiety. Without official narrative, imagination filled the gaps, often more effectively than propaganda. Fear no longer required demonstration. It was assumed. Within the military itself, the effects were profound. The emphasis on personal loyalty undermined cohesion, pitting units and officers against one another in competition for favor. Discipline became uneven, enforced rigorously in some contexts and ignored in others. This inconsistency further blurred moral boundaries. Actions once considered extraordinary became permissible if they aligned with perceived intent. Responsibility was displaced upward, absolving individuals who acted in anticipation of approval. Civilian society adapted through withdrawal. Political discussion receded from public spaces. Community leaders moderated their roles, avoiding positions that might attract scrutiny. The press, constrained by both formal restriction and informal pressure, narrowed its focus. Silence became a strategy, not of resistance, but of endurance. The state did not demand enthusiasm. Acquiescence was sufficient. International observers registered concern, but responses were measured. The absence of clear documentation complicated criticism. Reports circulated, but verification lagged behind events. Diplomatic engagement continued, often justified by the hope that stability might yet be preserved. This external caution reinforced internal impunity. The regime interpreted restraint as tolerance, and tolerance as permission. Authority without restraint proved efficient in the short term. Decisions were swift, opposition muted, and the appearance of order maintained. Yet this efficiency concealed fragility. Systems dependent on fear required constant reinforcement. Loyalty secured through intimidation lacked durability. As violence became systemic, it consumed not only opponents, but also the trust and competence necessary for governance. The state's capacity narrowed as its reach expanded. By the time fear was fully normalized, its origins were difficult to trace. There had been no single moment of rupture, no declaration that marked the transition. Instead, restraint had been dismantled incrementally, each step justified by necessity and obscured by routine. The result was a political environment in which power operated unchecked and violence, once a tool, became a condition. Authority endured, but the cost of the very structures that might have sustained it beyond the will of one man. In the weeks following the coup, Idi Amin presented himself as a corrective rather than a conqueror. His public statements emphasized restraint, reconciliation, and relief from the anxieties that had accumulated under prolonged political tension. He spoke in simple terms, accessible and reassuring, promising an end to arbitrary arrests and the restoration of normal civic life. For a population accustomed to guarded language and strategic ambiguity, this clarity carried weight. It suggested not sophistication, but sincerity, and in a political culture worn thin by calculation, sincerity itself became persuasive. Early gestures reinforced this impression. Political prisoners were released, their return to public life staged as evidence of renewed tolerance. Exiles were invited home, framed as victims of a divisive past rather than threats to the present. Amin's rhetoric drew heavily on the language of unity, invoking national identity over factional allegiance. These acts were symbolic, but symbols mattered. They provided visible contrast to the preceding years, during which authority had narrowed and dissent had been managed through suspicion. The new regime appeared to widen the space of belonging, at least rhetorically. For many Ugandans, the change felt less like an endorsement of military rule than a respite from uncertainty. The absence of immediate repression allowed daily life to continue without disruption. Markets functioned, transport resumed, and public order was maintained. Soldiers were visible, but their conduct was initially disciplined, reinforcing the narrative that the army had intervened to stabilize rather than dominate. In this calm, expectations softened. People judged the regime not by constitutional principle, but by lived experience, by whether fear receded or intensified. Foreign observers responded with similar pragmatism. Diplomatic communications emphasized continuity and the hope for stability in a region sensitive to upheaval. Amin's lack of ideological grandstanding reassured external partners wary of radical realignment. He positioned himself as a reliable interlocutor, committed to order and open to cooperation. Early meetings were cordial, marked by assurances that Uganda would honor its obligations and avoid internal excess. The absence of immediate violence allowed this narrative to take hold, at least temporarily. Yet beneath the surface of these promises lay institutional realities unchanged by rhetoric. The structures that had enabled the coup remained intact. The army continued to occupy a central role in governance. Its authority expanded rather than constrained. Civilian oversight was minimal, not through explicit abolition, but through neglect. Ministries functioned, but their autonomy was circumscribed by the knowledge that ultimate power rested elsewhere. Decision-making remained personalized, filtered through loyalty rather than procedure. Amin's leadership style reflected this tension. Publicly, he adopted the posture of a benevolent guardian, attentive to popular sentiment and responsive to grievances. Privately, power consolidated through informal channels. Promotions and appointments favored those who demonstrated personal allegiance. The distinction between state and leader blurred as authority became increasingly embodied. This personalization was not immediately disruptive. It often appeared efficient, but it displaced the slow work of institution building, substituting trust in individuals for trust in systems. The early popularity of the regime also drew on contrast with the immediate past. Obote's consolidation had alienated many constituencies, particularly those who felt marginalized by centralization. Amin's gestures toward inclusivity resonated with these groups, offering recognition without demanding coherence. He did not articulate a detailed political program, and for many, this absence was reassuring. It suggested flexibility and openness to adaptation rather than ideological rigidity. However, the gap between language and structure began to surface in subtle ways. Decisions were announced without explanation. Legal processes were suspended in practice, if not in law. The Army's role in civilian matters expanded quietly, justified as temporary measures to maintain order. Each exception normalized the next. The calm persisted, but it was a calm dependent on compliance rather than consent. For ordinary citizens, the consequences of these shifts were not yet tangible. Life improved in small ways. Fear receded, and public spaces felt less tense. Yet the mechanisms through which grievances could be addressed remained unclear. The regime's accessibility was personal rather than procedural. Praise and complaint alike traveled upward through informal networks, their outcomes unpredictable. This unpredictability did not immediately alarm. It was familiar, even expected, but it signaled a continuity with past weaknesses rather than their resolution. The promises of order thus rested on a fragile foundation. They were sustained by performance and perception, by the absence of visible harm rather than the presence of accountability. Amin's early rule benefited from the low expectations of a society exhausted by conflict and from the cautious optimism of observers eager for stability. The contrast between rhetoric and institutional reality had not yet produced overt consequence, but it had established a pattern. Order was promised, and, for a time, it seemed delivered. What remained uncertain was the cost of that order, and who would ultimately bear it.
By the mid-1970s, repression in Uganda had ceased to be reactive. It had become administrative. Violence no longer required moments of crisis or justification. It operated through systems that normalized secrecy and routine. What distinguished this phase of rule was not the visibility of brutality, but its organization. Power was exercised through institutions designed to obscure responsibility, fragment information, and render accountability impossible. The machinery did not rely on spectacle. It relied on procedure. Central to this system were intelligence units whose mandates were deliberately vague. They reported directly to the executive, bypassing civilian oversight and judicial review. Their authority extended across ministries, military units, and civilian spaces, allowing them to act without coordination or constraint. Arrests were conducted without warrants, often at night, by men who did not identify themselves beyond the assertion of state power. Detainees were rarely informed of charges. In many cases, records were never created, ensuring that disappearance itself became a bureaucratic outcome rather than an aberration. Detention facilities functioned outside formal penal systems. Some were repurposed military installations. Others were improvised spaces near intelligence headquarters. Conditions varied, but uncertainty was constant. Prisoners were moved without notice, interrogated without schedules, and held without timelines. This fluidity served a purpose. It prevented the formation of patterns that might be tracked or challenged. Families searching for relatives encountered a void of information, passed between offices that denied jurisdiction or knowledge. Absence became the state's most effective instrument. Purges within the military and civil service followed similar logic. Loyalty was tested not through performance, but through survival. Officers suspected of dissent were removed quietly, often reassigned before being detained. Their disappearance sent a message without requiring explanation. The lack of public trials or announcements minimized resistance. Those who remained learned to interpret silence as warning. Advancement depended increasingly on anticipation of intent rather than clarity of instruction. The routinization of repression reshaped professional behavior. Intelligence officers measured success not by outcomes, but by compliance. Reports emphasized activity over accuracy, reinforcing a culture in which suspicion was rewarded. Informants proliferated, motivated by fear, opportunism, or the hope of protection. This web of surveillance blurred the boundary between state and society. Trust eroded not only in institutions, but between neighbors, colleagues, and even family members. The state's reach extended through implication rather than presence. Leadership under Idi Amin encouraged this opacity. Public statements remained broad, invoking security and unity without detailing methods. This ambiguity insulated authority. Violence could be attributed to overzealous subordinates or denied altogether. The absence of documentation allowed multiple narratives to coexist, none verifiable. For victims, this meant erasure. For perpetrators, plausible deniability. The system functioned precisely because it resisted clarity. Economic and administrative life adapted to these conditions. Bureaucrats avoided decisions that might attract attention. Files were left incomplete, signatures withheld. The slow paralysis of governance was not imposed from above, but internalized. People learned that efficiency could be dangerous, that visibility invited scrutiny. Institutions continued to operate, but their purpose shifted from service to self-preservation. The machinery of repression thus consumed the machinery of state. International awareness grew, but response remained constrained. Reports from refugees and diplomats accumulated, yet confirmation lagged behind events. The regime's control over information limited external leverage. Engagement continued under the rationale of stability, reinforcing internal perceptions of impunity. The distance between observation and intervention widened, leaving those within the system to navigate its consequences alone. The emotional weight of this period lay not in isolated acts of violence, but in their predictability. Fear became procedural. People adjusted routines, altered routes, and moderated speech as reflex rather than choice. Grief unfolded privately, without acknowledgement or closure. The absence of public reckoning denied collective mourning, dispersing suffering into isolated households. The state did not demand belief, it demanded adaptation. By the time repression was fully institutionalized, it no longer required constant enforcement. Its mechanisms had become self-sustaining, embedded in habits and expectations. Violence was no longer exceptional. It was infrastructural. The machinery did not depend on chaos, but on order, an order defined by secrecy and control. In this system, power was exercised without visibility, and fear endured without announcement, shaping a society where the most consequential actions left the fewest traces. The economic rupture that followed Idi Amin's consolidation of power was neither accidental nor purely impulsive. It emerged from a convergence of ideology, suspicion, and the instrumental use of grievance. By the early 1970s, the regime increasingly framed economic control as a matter of national security, casting ownership and commerce as arenas of loyalty rather than productivity. Within this logic, the presence of Asian Ugandans, many of whose families had lived in the country for generations, was recast from historical circumstance into political liability. Economic difference became evidence of disloyalty, and prosperity itself was treated as a threat. The expulsion order was delivered with characteristic bluntness. Asian Ugandans were given limited time to leave, their citizenship questioned or revoked, their property seized in the name of redistribution. The act was presented as corrective, a reclaiming of the economy for true Ugandans. Public rhetoric emphasized justice and empowerment, portraying the move as long overdue redress for colonial favoritism. For some, this framing resonated. Decades of visible disparity had fostered resentment, and the promise of sudden access to businesses and homes carried undeniable appeal. Yet the economy that was being reclaimed was more complex than its slogans allowed. Asian Ugandans occupied critical positions across trade, manufacturing, and finance. They maintained supply chains, managed credit, and sustained networks that connected rural producers to urban markets. Their removal did not simply change ownership. It dismantled systems of knowledge and coordination built over decades. The speed of the expulsion ensured that transfer occurred without preparation. Businesses were handed to individuals selected for loyalty rather than expertise, often without inventories, training, or capital. The immediate effects were uneven but unmistakable. Shops reopened under new management, but shelves emptied quickly. Machinery sat idle for lack of maintenance or spare parts. Credit evaporated as banking relationships collapsed. The redistribution that had promised abundance delivered confusion. Those who received property found themselves responsible for enterprises they did not understand, operating within an environment increasingly hostile to initiative. Failure became common, but failure carried risk. Economic mismanagement could be interpreted as sabotage, incompetence as disloyalty. The state attempted to intervene, issuing directives and reorganizing oversight bodies, but these measures compounded the problem. Control replaced coordination. Price controls discouraged production, while arbitrary enforcement created opportunities for corruption. Scarcity intensified competition, and competition invited suspicion. The regime responded to shortages not by reform, but by coercion, deploying security forces to enforce compliance and suppress dissent. Economic decline thus fed directly into repression, providing both justification and pretext. Ordinary Ugandans experienced the unraveling through daily deprivation rather than abstract indicators. Goods that had once been routine became scarce or prohibitively expensive. Transportation faltered as fuel supplies tightened. Wages lost value in an economy where inflation outpaced adjustment. People adapted through informal markets, bartering, and reliance on personal networks. These adaptations sustained survival but undermined the formal economy further, shrinking the tax base and weakening state capacity. Within government, paranoia deepened. Economic failure was interpreted not as structural consequence, but as evidence of internal enemies. Officials blamed hoarding, sabotage, and foreign interference. Each explanation reinforced the need for surveillance and control. The intelligence apparatus expanded its reach into commercial life, monitoring traders and scrutinizing transactions. Arrests for economic offenses increased, often without clear standards. The line between criminality and misfortune blurred, and fear became a factor in economic decision-making. International isolation accelerated the decline. Sanctions reduced investment, and strained diplomatic relations limited access to credit and expertise. The regime's ideological framing dismissed these constraints as external hostility, further entrenching suspicion. Self-reliance was proclaimed, but the infrastructure required to sustain it had been eroded. The economy contracted not only in scale, but in complexity, losing the interdependence that allowed resilience. The redistribution of property, initially celebrated in some quarters, revealed its costs over time. What had been framed as liberation produced dependency on the state and its favor. Economic survival became contingent on political alignment, tying material well-being to loyalty. This dependency reinforced authoritarian control, even as it hollowed out productive capacity. The regime's grip tightened over a shrinking economy, extracting compliance from scarcity. By the mid-1970s, economic decline and repression were mutually reinforcing. Shortages justified force. forced disrupted production. Each cycle narrowed options, reducing governance to crisis management. The expulsion of Asian Ugandans thus marked more than a demographic shift. It signaled a transformation in how the state understood economy and power, replacing participation with possession and trust with fear. The material collapse that followed was not an unintended consequence, but an extension of a system that treated control as an end in itself, regardless of cost. As the years of Amin's rule accumulated, Uganda's position in the international system narrowed from cautious engagement to uneasy distance. Diplomatic relationships that had once been managed through routine exchange became strained by unpredictability. Statements issued from Kampala shifted tone abruptly, alternating between conciliation and provocation. Allies struggled to discern intent, and uncertainty itself became corrosive. Foreign policy, once a domain of calculated interest, increasingly reflected the internal rhythms of a regime that had come to distrust restraint. This shift was not merely stylistic. It reflected a deeper transformation in how authority understood the world beyond its borders. International criticism of human rights abuses and economic mismanagement was interpreted not as external observation, but as coordinated hostility. The language of diplomacy gave way to accusation. Public addresses by Idi Amin framed Uganda as a besieged nation, targeted for its independence and defiance. In this narrative, isolation was recast as proof of virtue and disagreement as evidence of conspiracy. Relationships with former partners deteriorated unevenly. Some governments reduced engagement gradually, scaling back aid and cooperation while maintaining formal ties. Others withdrew more decisively, responding to expulsions of diplomats or inflammatory rhetoric. Each rupture reinforced the regime's sense of encirclement. Loss of external validation intensified reliance on internal loyalty, tightening the inward turn already underway. The fewer voices that remained, the less likely they were to challenge prevailing assumptions. Diplomatic unpredictability mirrored domestic governance. Decisions were announced without consultation, sometimes reversed without explanation. Envoys found their access limited, their briefings inconsistent. The absence of institutional mediation meant that foreign policy reflected personal impulse rather than strategic continuity. Agreements depended on mood and perception, vulnerable to sudden collapse. This volatility discouraged long-term engagement, further narrowing Uganda's options. Isolation reshaped information flow at the highest levels. As external channels closed, the regime's understanding of the outside world grew distorted. Reports were filtered through intelligence services accustomed to confirming suspicion rather than testing it. Dissenting analysis carried risk. Advisors learned to frame information in ways that aligned with expectation, emphasizing threat over nuance. Over time, this feedback loop hardened belief into certainty. The regime did not merely suspect hostility, it assumed it as fact. Conspiracy thinking flourished in this environment. Economic decline, diplomatic setbacks, and internal unrest were attributed to coordinated sabotage. Foreign governments, exiles, and imagined networks merged into a single adversarial force. This abstraction simplified complexity while justifying repression. If all challenges were external in origin, internal violence became defensive. The inward turn thus reinforced itself, converting isolation into ideology. The psychological effects of this isolation were visible in decision-making. Public pronouncements grew grandiose, detached from material capacity. Announcements of military strength and international influence contrasted sharply with economic contraction and diplomatic marginalization. These declarations served a domestic purpose, projecting confidence in the face of scarcity. Yet they also revealed a widening gap between perception and reality. Policy became performative, aimed at sustaining belief rather than managing consequence. Within Uganda, the impact of international isolation was indirect but pervasive. Reduced trade and aid intensified shortages, while loss of external scrutiny emboldened internal actors. The regime interpreted limited response as acquiescence. This perception encouraged further excess, reinforcing the sense that authority could act without consequence. Isolation, thus, did not restrain behavior. It liberated it from comparison and correction. The narrowing of perspective also altered Amin's personal conduct. As external affirmation receded, symbolic gestures grew more extravagant. Titles accumulated, ceremonies multiplied. These acts were not random eccentricities, but compensations, attempts to assert significance in a world perceived as hostile. Authority turned inward, drawing validation from ritual rather than recognition. The state became a stage upon which reassurance was continually performed. Yet this inward focus carried cost. Strategic errors multiplied as decisions were made without reliable external reference. Impulsive actions replaced calibrated response. Each misstep reinforced isolation, closing channels that might have offered correction. The regime became increasingly self-referential, its worldview shaped by its own declarations. Reality intruded only through crisis, interpreted as confirmation rather than contradiction. By the late 1970s, Uganda's isolation was no longer temporary or contingent. It was structural, embedded in how power understood itself and its environment. The inward turn had amplified suspicion into certainty and impulse into policy. International disengagement did not cause delusion, but it removed the friction that might have checked it. In the absence of restraint, belief hardened into action, and action into consequence. The regime's world narrowed, and within that narrowing, decision-making grew more erratic, more absolute, and more detached from the limits that history would soon reassert. By the late 1970s, the Ugandan state confronted a narrowing set of options. Economic decline had reduced material leverage, repression had hollowed out institutional competence, and international isolation had limited diplomatic maneuver. Within this constricted space, external conflict presented itself not as strategy, but as release. War offered motion where governance had stalled, direction where policy had failed. It promised unity through threat and purpose through action, even as it drew resources from a system already under strain. The border with Tanzania became the focal point of this turn. Long marked by disputes and mutual suspicion, it offered a convenient theater in which internal weakness could be reframed as external challenge. Skirmishes and incursions were initially ambiguous, their origins contested and their significance downplayed. Yet ambiguity served the regime's needs. It allowed escalation without admission, response without accountability. Each clash was narrated as defense, reinforcing the image of a nation under siege. For Idi Amin, war functioned as distraction in the most literal sense. It redirected attention from scarcity and repression toward mobilization and spectacle. Military announcements replaced economic explanations. Public discourse shifted from shortages to sovereignty. The language of emergency justified further centralization of power, silencing dissent under the logic of national survival. In this context, aggression appeared purposeful, even inevitable, not because it solved underlying problems, but because it deferred them. The military, already politicized and unevenly disciplined, was thrust into a role it was ill-prepared to sustain. Years of patronage and purges had weakened command cohesion. Equipment was outdated, logistics unreliable. Yet these deficiencies were obscured by rhetoric that emphasized courage and destiny over capacity. Orders were issued with confidence disproportionate to preparation. The gap between declaration and execution widened, but acknowledgement of that gap carried risk. To question readiness was to question loyalty. War also offered a means of reasserting control over a restive security apparatus. External threat simplified internal hierarchies. It allowed leadership to demand obedience without negotiation, to punish hesitation as treachery. In the short term, this consolidation proved effective. Troops mobilized, borders were crossed, and the machinery of conflict set in motion. The act of movement itself created the impression of strength, momentarily masking decay. For civilians, the war intensified hardship without providing clarity. Resources were diverted toward the front, deepening shortages at home. Conscription and requisition disrupted already fragile livelihoods. Information was tightly controlled, filtered through proclamations that emphasized victory while omitting cost. Families learned of casualties through rumor rather than report. The distance between official narrative and lived experience grew, but avenues for expression had long been closed. Internationally, the conflict confirmed existing concerns. What had been viewed as erratic governance now manifested as regional destabilization. Diplomatic patience thinned, and external actors recalibrated their positions. Yet from within the regime, this response reinforced the familiar narrative of hostility. Escalation fed belief. Belief justified escalation. The logic was circular, insulated from correction. As fighting intensified, the limits of distraction became evident. Military setbacks could not be concealed indefinitely. Retreats contradicted proclamations, exposing the fragility beneath assertion. The very war intended to reassert control began to reveal the consequences of years of misrule. Supply failures, desertions, and disorganization surfaced, not as isolated incidents, but as patterns. The state's weakness, long managed through fear and performance, now confronted material reality. Still, the turn to war followed an internal logic shaped by preceding years. External aggression did not emerge from strategic calculation, but from accumulated habit. Governance had become reactive, reliant on force to resolve contradiction. When domestic tools lost efficacy, the same approach was projected outward. War was not departure, but extension, applying familiar methods to a broader stage. The cost of this extension was severe. Conflict accelerated collapse rather than arresting it. It consumed resources faster than they could be replaced, strained loyalties already thin, and invited opposition to coalesce beyond Uganda's borders. The state that sought renewal through war instead exposed its own exhaustion. Authority could command movement, but not sustain it. War, as distraction, ultimately revealed the limits of distraction itself. It demonstrated that force could redirect attention, but not restore capacity, could silence criticism, but not generate cohesion. The aggression that promised control instead amplified vulnerability, drawing the consequences of domestic failure into open confrontation. In choosing war, the regime acted consistently with its history, but in doing so, it hastened the reckoning that history had deferred. The turning point in Uganda's collapse did not arrive with a single dramatic gesture or the sudden disappearance of authority. It emerged through exposure. Military defeat stripped away the assumptions that had sustained rule through fear, revealing the limits of a system built on coercion rather than capacity. The war that had been intended to restore control instead illuminated how little remained to be controlled. What followed was not chaos, but unraveling, steady and cumulative, as the structures that had enforced obedience lost the ability to compel belief. The conflict with Tanzania placed unprecedented strain on the Ugandan military. Years of politicization had left the force top-heavy and fragmented, its command structure shaped more by loyalty than coordination. When confronted with organized resistance, these weaknesses became visible. Units failed to communicate, supply lines broke down, and orders were ignored or misinterpreted. Retreats occurred not as strategic withdrawals, but as improvised responses to pressure. The army that had dominated civilian life proved incapable of sustained external engagement. News of these failures traveled despite attempts at control. Soldiers returning from the front carried accounts that contradicted official statements. Civilians noticed the absence of confidence in those who had once embodied authority. The presence of uniforms no longer guaranteed compliance. Fear persisted, but it lost coherence. It no longer aligned with expectation of power. When fear ceased to promise safety, its utility diminished. Within the regime, the impact was destabilizing. Decision-making narrowed further as options disappeared. Advisors filtered information even more aggressively, attempting to preserve confidence by suppressing contradiction. Yet the scale of failure overwhelmed mediation. Territory was lost, equipment abandoned, and alliances eroded. Each loss undermined the narrative of inevitability that had sustained rule. Authority could still punish, but it could no longer persuade. The economic consequences compounded this erosion. War intensified shortages already severe, draining resources without replenishment. The state's capacity to reward loyalty shrank, weakening patronage networks that had held key constituencies in place. Officials accustomed to privilege found themselves exposed. As material incentives declined, allegiance frayed. Survival instincts replaced calculation, and silence replaced affirmation. Fear, once systemic, began to fragment. Individuals continued to act cautiously, but the shared understanding that had coordinated behavior dissolved. Rumors multiplied, but they no longer pointed in a single direction. Uncertainty replaced intimidation as the dominant condition. In such an environment, repression lost efficiency. Violence continued, but its deterrent effect diminished. Punishment no longer clarified boundaries. It highlighted desperation. The regime's international position deteriorated in parallel. Military defeat removed any remaining ambiguity about competence. External actors adjusted accordingly, increasing support for opposition forces and reducing tolerance for unpredictability. The inward narrative of encirclement persisted, but it now lacked credibility even within the regime. Isolation, once reframed as defiance, appeared increasingly as consequence. For Idi Amin, this period marked a shift from command to reaction. Public statements retained their confidence, but they no longer structured reality. Announcements failed to mobilize, and declarations lacked follow-through. Authority remained concentrated, but its reach shortened. Decisions were made rapidly and reversed just as quickly. The coherence that had once characterized even the regime's excesses gave way to improvisation. Civilian society sensed the change not through liberation, but through recalibration. People did not suddenly speak freely or assemble openly. Instead, they adjusted expectations. The state appeared less omnipresent, its interventions less predictable. Some fled, others waited. The habits of caution persisted, but they were no longer reinforced by consistent power. What replaced them was watchfulness without direction. The turning point lay precisely in this shift. Fear had been the regime's organizing principle, but fear required demonstration of control. Military defeat disrupted that demonstration. It exposed the gap between command and capacity, between assertion and execution. Once visible, that gap could not be concealed. Institutions hollowed by years of neglect could not be restored under pressure. Loyalty purchased through intimidation could not withstand sustained failure. There was no single moment when the regime collapsed. Instead, momentum changed direction. The forces that had once moved inward, consolidating authority, now pressed outward, dispersing it. Opposition gained traction not through dramatic uprising, but through accumulation of advantage. The state's responses grew narrower, more violent, and less effective, accelerating the very processes they sought to halt. This was the structural turning point. The regime still existed, still issued orders, still inflicted harm, but no longer shaped the future. The conditions that had enabled its rise, fragmentation, exhaustion, fear, had been exhausted themselves. What remained was power without momentum, authority without inevitability. The defeat on the battlefield did not end the regime, but it ended its logic. From that point forward, decline was no longer contingent. It was procedural, unfolding through the same mechanisms that had once enforced control, now unable to reverse their own consequences. The final collapse of Idi Amin's rule unfolded with a speed that belied its long preparation. What appeared rapid was, in fact, the release of pressures that had been building for years, constrained only by fear and inertia. Once those restraints failed, events moved quickly not because of sudden betrayal, but because the regime no longer possessed the means to slow them. Power did not vanish in a moment. It evacuated, withdrawing from spaces it could no longer hold. As opposing forces advanced and internal resistance stiffened, the state's administrative core faltered. Orders continued to be issued, but their reach was uneven. Communications broke down, not solely through sabotage but through neglect. Ministries functioned intermittently, uncertain which directives remained operative. Security units acted autonomously or not at all, their loyalties fragmented by exhaustion and calculation. The centralized authority that had once overridden institutional weakness now depended on institutions it had hollowed out. Military cohesion proved especially fragile. Units that had been bound together by patronage and fear faced conditions neither incentive could resolve. Supply failures left soldiers unpaid and undersupplied. Commanders, uncertain of reinforcement or support, hesitated to commit. Desertion increased, often quietly, without confrontation. The absence of coordinated resistance reflected not opposition, but disintegration. The army did not collapse dramatically. It thinned, losing density and direction. Within the capital, the atmosphere was marked less by celebration than by waiting. Civilians observed the retreat of authority through absence rather than confrontation. Checkpoints were abandoned. Officials failed to appear. Radio announcements grew irregular, then repetitive, recycling assurances disconnected from observable reality. The state's presence receded unevenly, leaving pockets of force amid growing vacuums. People adapted cautiously, drawing on habits of endurance rather than expectation of liberation. Amin's personal authority contracted alongside these failures. His movements became more restricted, his reliance on a shrinking circle more pronounced. Decision-making accelerated but lost coherence, shaped by urgency rather than strategy. Public statements continued, but they no longer structure events. Power, once exercised through anticipation and fear, now required direct enforcement that could not be sustained. The distance between command and outcome widened beyond recovery. The flight from power was not announced as abdication, but enacted through departure. As pressure mounted, Amin left the country, first temporarily, then definitively. His exit lacked the symbolism of overthrow. There were no formal handovers, no negotiated settlements. Authority simply ceased to be exercised from its former center. What remained was a network of unresolved violence and administrative debris, the residue of a system built for control rather than continuity. This departure did not resolve Uganda's crises. It exposed them. The structures left behind were ill-equipped to manage transition, having been shaped to serve personal rule rather than collective governance. The absence of Amin removed the focal point of authority, but not the damage done to institutions, economy, or social trust. Power had been personalized. Its removal revealed the extent to which it had displaced process. Analytically, Amin's fall illustrates the limits of coercive consolidation. Fear can suppress opposition, but it cannot generate resilience. Patronage can assemble loyalty, but it cannot substitute for capacity. The regime's collapse was not the result of a single error or betrayal, but of cumulative decisions that prioritized immediacy over durability. Each shortcut taken to resolve a crisis weakened the system's ability to absorb the next. International factors shaped the final phase, but did not determine it. External pressure accelerated collapse by constraining options and supporting opposition. Yet the regime's vulnerability was internal. Isolation magnified error, but error had already undermined legitimacy and function. By the time external forces pressed decisively, the state's capacity to respond had been largely exhausted. The speed of Amin's exit reflected this exhaustion. Once the perception of inevitability shifted, there was little to defend. Those who had benefited from proximity to power recalculated quickly, prioritizing survival over loyalty. The regime had taught them this logic. Allegiance had always been conditional. Its withdrawal followed the same pattern. In this sense, the flight from power was not anomalous but consistent. The system Amin built rewarded adaptation to force rather than commitment to institution. When force faltered, adaptation dictated departure. His fall did not invert the regime's logic. It completed it. The end of Amin's rule closed a chapter, but did not conclude the story it belonged to. The habits formed under repression persisted, shaping how authority would be contested and rebuilt. The analytical distance required to understand this moment lies in resisting personalization. Amin's departure mattered less as the fall of a man than as the exposure of a structure that could not sustain itself. Power fled because it had nowhere left to stand.
The Uganda that emerged after Amin's departure was not liberated so much as exposed. With the central figure of coercion removed, the state revealed the depth of its internal damage. Institutions that had appeared functional under pressure now showed how thoroughly they had been hollowed out. Authority existed, but it was fragmented, contested, and uncertain of its own reach. The end of personalized rule did not restore coherence. It made visible how little coherence remained. Socially, the country bore the marks of prolonged fear. Communities were intact in form, but fractured in trust. Years of surveillance, informants, and arbitrary violence had altered patterns of interaction. People spoke cautiously, even when there was no longer a clear object of fear. Silence had become habitual. Families searched for missing relatives without expectation of answers, their grief unresolved and unacknowledged. There were no mechanisms for collective reckoning, no shared language to process what had occurred. Trauma persisted not as spectacle, but as routine, shaping behavior in subtle, enduring ways. Economically, collapse was immediate and pervasive. Productive capacity had been eroded through mismanagement, expropriation, and flight. Infrastructure was degraded, supply chains disrupted, and skilled labor scarce. The informal economy sustained survival, but could not generate recovery. State revenues were minimal, limiting the ability to provide basic services. Inflation and scarcity distorted daily life, forcing choices oriented toward endurance rather than growth. Recovery required coordination and trust, both of which had been systematically undermined. Politically, uncertainty dominated. Competing factions claimed authority, each inheriting a state apparatus designed for command rather than negotiation. The absence of a unifying figure did not produce pluralism. It produced contention. Military elements remained influential, accustomed to intervention and skeptical of civilian restraint. Civilian leaders, aware of institutional weakness, governed defensively. The question was not how to build legitimacy, but how to prevent renewed collapse. The legal system exemplified this dilemma. Courts reopened, but their authority was compromised by years of irrelevance. Judges faced backlogs of cases involving property seizures, detentions, and unresolved deaths. The law existed, but its capacity to deliver justice was limited. Decisions risked reopening wounds without providing closure. In many cases, delay replaced resolution, perpetuating uncertainty under the guise of stability. Education and health systems reflected similar strain. Schools lacked resources and staff. Hospitals lacked supplies and confidence. Professionals who had remained during the worst years were exhausted. Those who had left were hesitant to return. Rebuilding required not only funding, but reassurance that commitment would not again be punished. The memory of abrupt policy reversals and violence discouraged long-term investment, both domestic and external. International engagement resumed cautiously. Aid flowed, but with conditions shaped by recent history. External actors emphasized stabilization over transformation, wary of provoking backlash. This caution limited ambition. Uganda was treated as a site of recovery rather than renewal, its future constrained by the need to avoid repeating the past. While this approach prevented immediate deterioration, it also slowed structural reform. The social fabric bore contradictions. Relief at the end of overt terror coexisted with anxiety about what might follow. People adapted pragmatically, rebuilding routines without expectation of protection. Authority was tolerated rather than trusted. Political participation remained muted, shaped by the memory that visibility could be dangerous. The habits formed under repression did not dissipate with its end. They lingered, shaping responses to new leadership. The absence of resolution was itself destabilizing. Without formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, responsibility remained diffuse. Victims lacked recognition, perpetrators lacked accountability, and institutions lacked precedent for ethical constraint. The temptation to frame Amin's exit as closure was strong, but inaccurate. His departure removed a source of violence without repairing its mechanisms. The state had been used as an instrument of fear. Its reconstruction required redefining its purpose, a task far more complex than replacing leadership. In this aftermath, the most striking feature was fragility. Not collapse, but vulnerability. Uganda functioned but tentatively. Each decision carried the weight of recent memory, each reform shadowed by doubt. The ruins were not only material, but procedural, embedded in how power was understood and exercised. The legacy of Amin's rule thus persisted beyond his absence. It shaped the constraints within which recovery occurred, limiting imagination as much as capacity. The challenge facing Uganda was not simply to move forward, but to relearn governance without fear as its organizing principle. This process could not be instantaneous. It required time, trust, and restraint, resources more difficult to rebuild than infrastructure or currency. The aftermath revealed that authoritarian collapse does not resolve authoritarian damage. It exposes it. Uganda's post-Amin landscape was not a new beginning, but a reckoning deferred, a moment when the costs of accumulated decisions became unavoidable. The state remained, but its foundations had shifted. What followed would depend not on erasing the past, but on confronting how deeply it had reshaped the present.